All right, seventh grader. As I promised, we're getting into cells. So let's start. When we start talking about cells, we need to break down the whole category of living things. And when you think about if something is living versus if something is non-living, I want you to think about Mrs. Nerg, old Mrs. Nerg. She is going to help us remember the 7 characteristics of living things. So let's break it down. The M stands for movement, the R stands for reproduction, the S for sensitivity, woo, can't get that one out, N for nutrition, E for excretion, R for respiration, and G for growth. So what do all of these mean? Well, movement, pretty obvious, right? Every living thing will move. Reproduction, every living thing will reproduce. Whether it's us humans, whether it's an animal, whether it's a tiny little cell, all of it will reproduce. Sensitivity. No, not if you got like little sensitive emotions and you cry. No. Sensitivity is its response to stimuli, which is kind of like sensitive emotions, right? So sensitivity to stimuli means that it's going to respond if something happens to it. For example, it might respond if it gets poked. It might respond if it has a lack of nutrients. It might respond if it has a lack of water. It might respond if it encounters a virus or another cell. So it's when these stimuli get put in there, these are different kind of things that can happen to that cell. It's going to be sensitive to those if it's a living thing. All right, what about nutrition? It's going to need nutrition. Every living thing needs energy and needs to be fed. All right, excretion. Woo! So if you don't know what excretion means, it means getting rid of that waste product. So we're going to talk about this in the human body because we all know what happens when we get rid of our waste. Well, there's a couple ways, but we know that one way, right? So every living thing needs to get rid of waste. So one way that we do is we breathe in that oxygen, but what do we do with that? We breathe out, and that we release what? Carbon dioxide. We're getting rid of that waste. We're excreting that waste. Respiration, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. You talked about this in 6th grade with Miss Browndorf. It's got to breathe. It's kind of like all of your cells have to breathe. And growth, every living thing will grow. So let's keep going. So way back, some great scientists like Robert Hooke and Louis Pasteur, they did some work with cells, and they came up with the cell theory. So remember, a theory is something in science that it's not a law, but it has been supported by a lot of evidence that it could be true. So this is what they came up with when they were trying to answer the question, where do cells come from? Because if you can imagine, they didn't have all the knowledge that we currently have. They were still trying to figure out, well, where do these even little tiny structures come from that they had just found? Well, they came up with 3 different things. One is that every living thing is made up of 1 or more cells. So what's the smallest unit of life you can have? A cell, right? 2, cells carry out functions needed to support life. So your cells are going to be what keep you living as well as other organisms. And then last but not least, cells come only from other living cells. Does this mean they can come from dead cells? No, they only come from other living cells. All right. So what do these cells need? So we kind of talked about how they came up with the theory. Well, we talked about the theory, but we also need to talk about what those different cells need. And organisms are going to need, so this is multi-structured or even just cells, they're going to need energy, material, and living space. So they're going to need that energy that we talked about, right? It's actually right above me on this wall. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred, right? So it's got to be transferred from somewhere. And most living things, actually almost maybe the rare occasion, but we can trace it all back to that energy originally coming from the sun, right? So that energy from the sun is in a lot of different processes turned into energy that organisms and cells can use. Cells also need that living space. They need space and able to grow and just be alive. They need materials. This is nutrients, this is food, this is things to feed it. They need that in order to survive. And last but not least for this video, we're going to talk about the different types of cells that you can have. I was talking about, multi-celled organisms, and I also mentioned those single cells. Well, we don't call them single cells. We call them unicellular. Uni, that prefix means one. So a unicellular organism is going to be made up of one single cell. All right, but they still need all of those Mrs. Nerg things, but they're just one cell. Multicellular is going to be made of multiple, many cells. We are multicellular. Now, plants are multicellular. They have different types of cells within them. So we have skin cells, we have bone cells, we have blood cells. All right, plants have root cells, and they have a variety as well. And then there's a third one, bacteria. Bacteria are tiny single-cell organisms, and you've probably heard about this a lot. Bacteria can be good, and bacteria can be bad. In your body, you have really good bacteria, and in your body, you most likely have some bad bacteria too, especially if you're touching your desk right now. So as we continue to talk about cells, we'll talk about the different types or the different parts of the cell that carry out these functions of life. But remember, when you think about a living cell or a living organism, what do you need to think? Mrs. Nerg, right? So if you didn't catch that, go back and make sure you've really gotten those notes so that we can characterize if something is living versus non-living. All right, keep calm and rock on, Hilburn Hawks.